Good morning. It's a joy to be with you this morning. Are you getting used to the short days yet? Uh, Neither am I. Every year I know it's coming, but I still have a hard time adjusting to it. Just getting dark so quickly. I remember as a young kid one time, my family took a modest adventure to a cave in western Oklahoma. And if you've been on many cave or cavern tours, you know what happens about halfway through it, right? You get about a half mile into the cavern, and then what does the tour guide do? Shut off the light. And I remember being hit by the heaviness of that darkness. It was the first time in my life I'd ever experienced that total pitch blackness, that sort of darkness that your eyes just can't negotiate with. It was that realization that there really are places in this world where light just doesn't exist. You ever had that experience? I think the next time I felt something along those lines was years later. It came whenever the phone rang, and I received news that one of my dearest brothers in Christ in Slovakia, Andre, I've told you about Andre before, how he used to recite Psalm 23 in defiance of the gypsy gangs that would beat him up as a boy. But I got the phone call that Andy had been killed in a car crash. Actually, a motorcycle accident. The same motorcycle that he drove 6 hours to come and visit me whenever our daughter was born. And I remember at the funeral, the chapel was overflowing with people. Everybody was standing, and shoulder to shoulder. Outside, there were hundreds of people listening to the eulogy via a PA system. And I remember when my eyes fell on Katka, Andy's widow, how my heart just protested with that sense of darkness. Lord, how could you allow this? How could you let this righteous man be taken from his wife and 2 infant sons? And then at that moment, Addie, our oldest, she was just 2 years old at the time. But she was sitting on my shoulders, and as my head was down, I felt this little hand slap me in the temple. And Addie, she said words with, some of her earliest words, in fact, with total clarity. Jesus, she said. And I looked up, and she wasn't pointing to heaven. She was pointing at the emblem that was carved on Andy's coffin lid, the cross of Christ. Out of the mouth of babes, the psalmist said. There is no darkness so complete that the light of Christ can't trespass on it. I don't know or presume to know what your darkness is. For some, darkness comes creeping in, slowly, gently, quietly. For others, darkness storms the gates. It comes in unannounced. It overturns the tables of your life. And still for others, the darkness just seems to accumulate. Layer on layer until one day you realize that it's become the air that you breathe. We know about darkness. Isaiah knew about darkness. For the case of ancient Israel, Assyria, the impending army of a foreign nation, that was the darkness that doesn't merely conquest. Whenever Assyria comes, Assyria erases what it touches. It swallows entire societies and peoples and grinds their identity to dust. Its terror was so total that families would learn to whisper. Mothers would memorize the faces of their children just in case the dawn would take them away. See, to meet Assyria was to have hooks in your jaw. Literally. To enter a night with no promise of dawn. Isaiah calls it gloom, anguish, deep darkness. And even though the darkness that you and I experience comes in different circumstances, I think we can still recognize the vocabulary from our own lives. Many of us know the darkness intimately. It comes in a hospital waiting room. When you're waiting for somebody, a nurse, a doctor, just anybody to come with news. Or at the grave of a spouse, or a child, or the death of a dream, or even a marriage. that phone call that splits life into before and after. It doesn't have to be an Assyrian army, but it carries the same cold breath and whispers the same lies and casts the same long shadow over our soul. And it's into that world of darkness, both theirs and ours, that Isaiah speaks an audacious word. He says in verse 1, which wasn't read for us, it begins with this word: nevertheless. You know what nevertheless means, right? Nevertheless is the word that you use when the situation's already gone sideways. It's the word that you reach for when the worst has in fact happened. And yet something inside of you refuses to surrender final word to disaster. I remember when I was 17 years old and I wrecked my pickup truck. This was a spectacular act of adolescent brilliance. My parents, they spent 6 months deliberating whether they were raising a son or a public menace on the highways. And they finally relented and they bought me another vehicle. Not because I earned it. Not because I had grown wiser. Not because I'd done anything other than deserve a stern talking to and a bicycle. But because after a long parental sigh, they said, nevertheless. Nevertheless. That means mercy is about to enter and elbow its way into the story. Nevertheless means that a better word is being spoken over a bad situation. Nevertheless means that the narrative isn't over where you thought it was over. And so here Isaiah again, nevertheless, the story won't end in gloom. Nevertheless, the darkness isn't sovereign. Nevertheless, God's already begun a work that the night cannot extinguish. Nevertheless, Isaiah says, there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. As though the prophet standing knee-deep in the ruins of a nation with smoke still rising and the memory of Assyrian boots still echoing in the streets, and he dares to say, yes, the darkness is real. Yes, the anguish is deep. Yes, the wounds still bleed. Nevertheless, this isn't denial. This is defiance. This is hope standing its ground. The kind of hope that refuses to be intimidated by the night because it knows something that the night doesn't know. God already has set the sunset in motion. How do I know that? Well, because Isaiah continues, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Not the flicker of a candle struggling against the wind. Not the shimmer of a lone star on the horizon. No, a great light. A light of another order. A light that makes the darkness tremble. A light that exposes what the night tries to hide. A light that's strong enough to reorder the world. But here's the paradox. That Isaiah understands, that we understand actually if we think about it. The whole biblical story testifies to it, and that is this. When we've been living long in the dark, when we're used to it, we fear brightness. We flinch at hope. Our eyes, they turn from grace. You see, the human condition's always been carried by this strange impulse towards self-imposed blindness. Even if you remember your freshman philosophy class reading Plato's allegory of the cave. It's the same pattern that explains why Jesus was rejected. We hate the light because it exposes our shadows. Even when it's the very truth that we need. We become nostalgic for the night. In humanity, we cling to our caves. We mistake bondage for safety and shadow for reality. And yet, even in our recoil from the light doesn't withdraw. So what is this great light? Well, the Gospel of Matthew answers it plainly. It's Jesus. His birth in Bethlehem, his ministry in Galilee of the nations, that very first region that was humiliated by the Assyrians. You see, here's the divine surprise. The whole promise of nights in turns on the arrival of a child. Not a general, not a king wearing armor, not a political alliance with Assyria or Egypt, not a marble hero like Samson. No, a child. And you can almost hear ancient Israel mutter, can't you? That's it? That's God's answer to Assyria? A baby? If we're honest, I think we do the same thing. What good's a child when what we want is immediate deliverance? What good's a child when the diagnosis is terminal, the grief unbearable, the anxiety suffocating us? What good's a child when we need a fixer, not a newborn? And yet Isaiah doesn't retreat from the claim. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. And then he stretches the Hebrew tongue to its limits because he applies these titles to this child that no ordinary kid could bear. Wonderful Counselor, wisdom older than the stars, mighty God, strength that breaks every yoke, everlasting Father, the heart of God made flesh, Prince of Peace, the one who reconciles all things together. See, these aren't just seasonal slogans that we use in the holidays. They're theological earthquakes, because Isaiah is declaring that God's answer to the world's darkness isn't force. It's a person. As Isaiah says, the government shall be upon his shoulder. Think about what that means for a moment. The weight of this world on his shoulder. Not yours. Not mine. The responsibility for justice and righteousness and peace doesn't rest with a committee or with a political party or on a president or on a movement. It's not on the stock market. It's on him. His governance, by the way, isn't limited to the spiritual realm. It's not confined to Sunday mornings or private devotions. Isaiah isn't saying that Jesus is going to govern your prayer life while somebody else governs the nation. No, his authority stretches over everything. Over the markets, when they're swinging and shaking and keeping you up at night, over the seasons of your life from birth and grief and gain and loss and youth and age, over the geopolitical situation, no matter how unstable the world seems to be, over rulers, whether they acknowledge him or not, over history, which bends towards his kingdom, whether you recognize it or not. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth have been given to me. Not some, not most, all of it. Paul says he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. That means that when everything else feels like it's falling apart, he's the one holding the bolts in place. The Hebrews writer says he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Not by political power, not by economic power, not by coercion, by his word. So what does that mean for you? It means you can rest. You can breathe again. You can stop acting as though the survival of your family and your future and your finances or your country rests squarely on your shoulders. They rest on his. And his shoulders are strong enough to bear the government. And they're the same shoulders that are strong enough to bear you in your worry and in your fear and in your what-ifs and in your sleepless nights. If he carries the world, then you don't have to. And you know, Matthew, like I said, notices something beautiful, something that I think is easy to overlook if we're not paying attention. That is, according to Matthew, this light that shines in the darkness first dawns in Galilee of the Gentiles. Not in Jerusalem, where the religious authority is, not in Rome, where the political powerhouse is, not in Athens, where the intellectuals reside, but in Galilee. This region, like I said, that had suffered the very first blow of the Assyrian invasion. This land that was considered spiritually compromised, culturally mixed up, politically unstable, spiritually second class. If you were drawing a strategy for where Israel's Messiah should make his appearance, Galilee wouldn't make the list. But that's the point. Light breaks where darkness has been the deepest. That's the pattern of God. He always begins at the margins with shepherds, not scholars, with fishermen, not Pharisees, with a young virgin in Nazareth, not a royal in some palace, with a manger, not a throne. God doesn't wait until we're strong. God doesn't wait until we're polished or put together. God doesn't wait until the conditions are just right or until we've proven ourselves worthy of His invitation. No, He sends a child. He sends the light. He sends Himself. And then Isaiah, he ends this crescendo with the most stabilizing phrase in the whole passage. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this, not your zeal, because it runs out. Not your discipline, because even the strongest among us are going to falter. Not your frantic attempts to keep all the plates spinning at once and solve all the problems or control all the outcomes. No, God will do this. God will send a child. God will break the yoke. God will shatter the rod. God will burn the garments of war. God will establish the government of peace. God will uphold the kingdom with justice and righteousness forever. The zeal of the Lord, His passion, His covenant love, His unstoppable commitment to freedom will accomplish what you can't. And that's why we hope. Because the weight of salvation doesn't rest on our shoulders. It rests on the shoulders of the one who's strong enough to bear the cross and gentle enough to carry you. Because the truth is, even in the dark, His eyes have remained upon you. To Him, the darkness is as light. You see, if Isaiah has anything to teach us, it's this. Hope isn't a denial of darkness. It's defiance in the face of it. See, hope is a discipline. Hope is a habit. Hope is formed in us like muscle memory through practices that bend our lives toward His coming light. So what does it mean to live as a people who have seen a great light, even though we dwell in a land still shadowed by death? Let me recommend 3 disciplines for you to begin this week. I'm not talking about tasks that are going to earn you God's favor or something. I'm talking about habits that retrain your heart to live by the light that's already dawned. Here's the first one. Develop the discipline of attention. Look for the light. You know, darkness is deceptive. It creeps into the corners of our mind until it feels normal. It numbs us, it dulls us, it teaches us to expect nothing, to see nothing, to look for nothing. That's why Isaiah's announcement is so startling. To them a light has shone. Not a light will show someday, not might show if we behave better. No, has already, now, even here shone. But here's the difficulty. Light doesn't arrive with a trumpet blast. Usually it comes the way the morning does. Softly, steady, unnoticed unless you're paying attention. Got to get up early. The sun doesn't snap on like a light switch. It rises slowly, and if you're distracted, you're going to miss the moment when the night actually ended. And so Isaiah, he invites us into this discipline that Scripture commends again and again and again. Attention. Not the twitchy reflex of the scroll, not the mental hamster wheel of worry, but the deliberate turning of the heart towards God, the way that a sunflower turns towards the first hint of dawn. Attention. That means sitting long enough to notice where God's already begun a work. Attention means registering the small miracles and mercies that are tucked away into your otherwise ordinary day. That word of encouragement that arrived out of nowhere. That prayer that you didn't think God heard, but later discovered He had. That strength that you shouldn't have had, but somehow you did. That's the Spirit's peace and reassurance that you felt when you needed it the most. Paul, he calls this setting your mind on things above. David calls it considering the works of the Lord. So for some of you, the most practical discipline of hope this week you can take, maybe just asking at the end of each day, where did the light shine today? And that answer, it might seem small, but guess what? Everything that God builds, every redemption story, every restoration, it always begins with something small. After all, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Secondly, develop the discipline of rejoicing. Let joy have its voice. Isaiah says, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest. Now, by joy, I don't mean, naive, fake grinning. This isn't some plastered-on cheerfulness. This isn't that hollow smile that sometimes we force on ourselves when people ask, how are you doing? And we really don't have an answer. No, this is joy. But notice it's joy before deliverance is even complete. Joy before the fields are fully garnered. Joy before the Assyrian threat is gone. Joy in the gap between the promise and the fulfillment. Joy in the wilderness. Remember how Israel sang a song for joy on the far side of the Red Sea, even though the desert still stretched wide in front of them? That's the kind of joy that grows not out of your circumstances, but from your confidence in the character and deliverance of God. That's why Paul says, rejoice in hope. Not rejoice in your circumstances. Those are going to change. Not rejoice in your resolution, because some tensions are going to take years, even decades to heal, and may never at that. Not rejoice in your clarity, because God doesn't give us a detailed map. Rejoice in hope. Rejoice in the certainty that God will be faithful before you see how He will be faithful. And for some of you, that's going to feel unnatural at first, like using a limb that's been in a cast for a while. But biblical rejoicing is not emotional exuberance. It's an act of allegiance. It's the soul standing at attention and declaring, my hope is accounted for in heaven, not earth. My future is secured by Christ, not my circumstances. My joy flows from His resurrection, not the resolution of my problem today. And so make rejoicing a discipline, a habit that shapes your heart. Name the goodnesses of God. Count your blessings one by one at the dinner table, even as the day wears you thin. In prayer with your spouse or your children, and in the car, in traffic, when it's creeping along and your frustrations are about to pop in the middle of a hard week, and you feel like you've just been rolling upstream. Not because life's painless, not because everything's peachy, but because Christ is risen. And wherever He stands, joy has permission to break in the room, even before victory arrives. Here's the third discipline, the discipline of resistance. Push back against the night. When Isaiah talks about light, he doesn't describe this gentle glow or sentimental comfort. He uses these types of verbs. You have shattered the yoke. You have broken the staff. You have burned the garments of war. Listen, these are not words for people who've made a peace with the dark. These are words for people who are rising up against it. In other words, Isaiah, he's not describing how things feel. He's announcing what God has already begun. And so what does that mean for you and me? It means that hope is not passive. Hope resists. Hope refuses to let darkness dictate the terms of our lives. Hope is not sitting back wishing the world would just be better. Hope is stepping into the day with the defiance that someone who knows the tomb is empty is here. And that resistance, it takes on concrete forms. Some of you, that means reaching out again to somebody you've withdrawn from. You let grace have the first word instead of anger and fear. For some of you, resistance means seeking help, getting counseling or accountability or community, and not letting depression or addiction have the last say. For others of you, resistance means generosity in a tight season. For others of you, resistance looks like worship. You lift your voice even though your heart's heavy. You declare that Christ is king even when the world feels unmoored. Hope's not a mood. Hope's not a personality trait. Hope's not optimism. It's warfare. It's standing your ground and saying with Isaiah and every prophet before him, I know how this story ends. I know who carries the government on his shoulders. I know that light has already begun the work that darkness can't undo. Now earlier I told you I was going to give you 3 practical disciplines, but as we read through the words of Isaiah here, they're insisting on a 4th. And maybe it's the most critical of all. Isaiah, he concludes the prophecy with this most important line in this passage. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Not your zeal, not your frantic effort, not your anxious attempts to script the future. No, God will complete this. This is the holy determination of a God who keeps breaking open closed worlds. And that's why the discipline of waiting matters so much. Because waiting, in the biblical sense, isn't passive. It's not idle. It's not a spiritual version of standing in line down at the DMV. No, waiting is trusting in a God who keeps his promises precisely when you no longer have the strength to keep yours. Waiting isn't a stall out. It's formation. Waiting is the work of God shaping your heart so that when the light breaks, you can bear it. Waiting is learning, like Solomon said, to lean not on your own understanding, but wait for the faithfulness of the Lord. Waiting says with Habakkuk, though it tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. That's not wishful thinking. That's certainty. Confidence grounded in the God who raised Jesus from the dead. See, in Scripture, the people who wait are never the passive ones. Noah waited for a world to be washed clean. Abraham waited for a child he thought would never come. Joseph waited in a prison cell until God raised him up to lead nations. Simeon waited in the temple until his eyes saw the salvation of the Lord. The early church waits for the blessed hope, the appearing of Christ, Titus 2:13. Waiting is the furnace where faith is tempered. It's where anxiety learns to lose its grip, where hope digs down deep roots within us. The zeal of the Lord will do this. Not I. Not my strength. Not my plan. He will do it. That's the discipline of waiting. You know, since I'm feeling nostalgic about Slovakia and spelunking, I want to close with just one more memory. Years after Andy's funeral, it took Addie, she was about 3.5 at the time, with me to this cave in Slovakia that we nicknamed the Ice Cream Cave. And I carried her some in the crook of my arm, but she was old enough to walk at other times. And then came the moment you know what happened, except I was wearing these glow-in-the-dark acetate glasses. And so when the lights turned off, of course, everybody gasped at first, and then they started laughing at my floating neon spectacles like a ghost in the cave. But Addie, she never cried, because even in the darkness, she knew where she was, held in her father's arms, and she knew with certainty that her father's eyes were fixed on her. If we can bless you this day, won't you come? As together we stand and sing.